In the late 1940s, Cuba was a fairly successful nation by Caribbean standards of the time, as most countries in the region were poor, with a somewhat uneducated population. It had a strong economic potential in being a very popular vacation spot visited by tourists from around the world, including the United States. In this period, bilateral relations began to form between Cuba and the U.S., placing the island nation within the Western sphere of influence. However, this forward progress would all be thrown away in 1959 when dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown. Fidel Castro has led the nation of Cuba from 1959 until 2008. He is well known for his opposition against the United States and greatly harming Cuba. However, Castro has also given his people resources that many countries still cannot provide for their residents. While Fidel Castro has left his country in abysmal living conditions and has not allowed Cubans to help themselves due to his focus on opposing the United States, he has helped the Cuban people by educating them and giving them free health care, the tools of a once potential economic superpower to regain their economic status. Castro showed extreme left-wing views in sparking unsuccessful revolutions. From 1953 to 1959, Castro showed strong opposition to Batista's dictatorship, waging guerrilla warfare in an attempt to overthrow the authoritarian government. He had unsuccessfully tried to take down the governments of the Dominican Republic and then his native Cuba, getting him and his brother Raul Castro sent to prison for 15 years. Upon being released, they traveled to Mexico, where they met Che Guevara, an Argentine physician turned communist revolutionary. The trio spent the next 2 years traveling between the United States and Mexico, trying to gain support for their ideologies. Eventually, a group of exiles landed in Cuba, where most were slaughtered, but 13 escaped to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Among them were the Castro brothers and Guevara. Cuban dictator Batista made the grave mistake of paying little attention to the small group of survivors. He easily could have crushed them, but due to the lack of care, Fidel Castro and his forces were able to overthrow Batista. Castro then placed himself in power, beginning his lengthy control over Cuba. He had initially given the presidency and prime ministership to others in his group, but named himself the prime minister soon after. On January 1st, 1959, the revolution ended with Batista being overthrown entirely and Castro taking all leadership over Cuba, establishing a socialist state. At first, Cuba remained in decent standing with the United States. In 1960, the Eisenhower administration pledged $500 million to Latin America as a development fund. It is said that it was Fidel Castro who inspired this fund to be given to Latin America. Later, Kennedy's Alliance for Progress was created with the intention of improving Latin American economies, but Castro felt that the United States was still responsible for Batista's dictatorship because they supported Batista heavily with millions of dollars. In 1961, Castro nationalized all American businesses in Cuba without reimbursement. Additionally, he formed ties with the Soviet Union and declared Cuba to be an enemy of the United States. As a result of these actions, all diplomatic relations between America and Cuba were severed, and remained so for decades. Castro moved towards improving the Cuban standard of living by building schools and hospitals. As time passed following the revolution, Castro expanded his own powers. The positions of President of the Council of State and Commander-in-Chief, which he vowed not to take, soon became his, and relations with the U.S. began deteriorating even further. The CIA began a campaign of assassination attempts on Castro, from poisoning his cigars to booby-trapping conch shells at the bottom of his favorite scuba diving location. In total, an estimated 638 attempts were made on Castro's life, the most significant being the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was when a militia of 1,500 Cuban exiles, funded by the CIA, invaded Cuba. In addition to killing Castro, the goal of this invasion was to topple the communist government entirely and bring Cuba back into the American sphere of influence. However, this backfired when the exiles were deterred and captured, stopping the invasion and causing the Soviet Union to increase its relations further with Cuba. The strengthened relationship became apparent when Castro requested that the USSR place nuclear weapons in Cuba to intimidate the US and improve Soviet first strike capabilities. His request was met, and missiles were placed just 90 miles outside of the United States. For 13 tense days of October of 1962, during what is now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, it seemed like the Cold War would finally heat up, with the United States and the Soviet Union on the edge of thermonuclear catastrophe. In the midst of the crisis, President Kennedy addressed the American public, explaining the situation and announcing a naval blockade of Cuba, which would go on to stay in place for decades. However, Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union at the time, eventually agreed to remove the missiles on the condition that the United States did not invade Cuba. And while this decision eased some of the tension between America and the USSR, it greatly strained Soviet relations with Cuba, as Castro felt betrayed for not having been involved. Although Cuban-Soviet relations were worse, Castro did not give up or even modify the socialist government that had now turned into the one thing that he once hoped to remove from Cuba, a dictatorship. The Cuban people believed that Fidel had plans to make Cuba a better nation, and his charisma and strong image won their favor. He was trusted by his people through many years due to his strong leadership. His image as a relentless man attempting to defend a little nation from the big bad USA made him a hero in the eyes of many. Thus, the scary potential invasion of Cuba was forgotten by its people because Castro appealed to them. Cuba was getting by, but living conditions were declining. By the time the 70s had rolled in, the truth of life in Cuba was realized, and so began the mass migrations from Cuba to Florida as millions of Castro's people boarded boats to escape the country. In 1992, the Cuban Democracy Act of America tightened the embargo on Cuba to such an extent that Castro had to reconsider his radical views before finally giving in and becoming more timid. Castro had stolen billions of Cuban tax dollars, making him largely responsible for the impoverished population. However, Castro began providing resources to the Cuban people, such as free health care and education. This gave the Cuban people opportunities to gain prerequisites for jobs. The literacy rate of Cuba rose from 73 to 99.8% by 2003, and unemployment rate fell down to 3.8% compared to America's current 5.5. Additionally, currently a mere 1.5% of Cubans live under the poverty line, as opposed to America's 14.5%. These statistics indicate Cuba's recent success in comparison to the United States. On February 24th of 2008, Castro resigned as a result of his increasing age and deteriorating health, giving power to his brother, Raul Castro. Since his retirement, Fidel has begun to repair relations with the United States despite his lack of political power. Looking back at Fidel Castro's lengthy reign, significant issues come up that cannot be addressed by statistics. Castro was a suppressor of dissident. He banned newspapers that contradicted him and jailed political opponents. He was a strict and absolute monarch, denying basic freedoms to his citizens. He has controlled the lives of individuals, leaving them incapable of making their own decisions. However, Fidel Castro has provided his people with important resources and given them the ability to begin to form an economically successful country. And while Fidel Castro hasn't allowed people to help themselves in Cuba, he has, in his own ways, helped them.